All right, hello everyone, and thank you for tuning in once again to the Black Box Podcast, BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. I did an upload on this channel recently about Alex Jones, and he is somebody who talks a lot about the New World Order, but it's actually so much bigger than just the presentation that he makes to the general public and his audience and followers and so on. It's like people have talked about this stuff for a long time, and it's one of the few things in life that is actually kind of bipartisan, multifaceted. People from all sides of the political spectrum talk about the New World Order just in different ways. And we've also talked about things on this channel like the Lyndon LaRouche movement, the Tax Wall Street Party, and they have their own names for these types of New World Order things. Like the Tax Wall Street Party talks about the Anglo-American Alliance, and the Lyndon LaRouche movement just refers to them as the British. And sometimes the larger things like the British system of political economy based on speculation, or even other names, just like the remnants of the British Empire. Now, what exactly is all of this stuff? Well, in the biggest thing, we have to recognize that I'm listening to a wide variety of backgrounds on this. Not just the Tax Wall Street Party, Lyndon LaRouche, Alex Jones. There are more people than this. I mean, so many people have talked about the New World Order in a variety of ways, and it goes back, to the stuff from the French Enlightenment and before. And in all reality, I mean, like, even if you look at the stuff like Joseph Farrell and Financial Vipers of Venice, it's talking all about how Rome was an empire of territory, but Venice, I repeat, Venice was an empire of financial control, economic control, and the banksters of Italy kind of gained sort of an economic stronghold in Europe. And while Rome fell as a territorial empire, 476, right? But Venice never fell. And then the financial connections of Venice moved toward Great Britain because it was impractical to run sort of a global empire from a swamp in the Adriatic Sea. So they moved toward Great Britain. And I mean, there are various reasons and many, many detailed presentations about this on YouTube. Like, what would you say? The Black Venetians, the Venetian conspiracy, the oligarchs of Venice. And we mentioned Joseph Farrell already, Financial Vipers of Venice. But how does this get to the New World Order? How do we get to some worldly thing? Well, in all reality, it's the concept of oligarchy. But we have to remember that in these New World Order theories, it's not just the people, it's also the interactions, the exchanges, the financial and economic connections. But when you want to listen to somebody like Alex Jones talk about this stuff, how do you actually get to the rubber meeting the road? I mean, someone was talking to me about World War II yesterday, and I'm very open on this channel. I am not a historian. I mean, so I like to listen to what people say so I can learn from them because, I'm not a PhD in history. I have a lot to learn. And they're talking about World War II, and I was just remembering some of the stuff from Alex Jones and the Lyndon LaRouche movement and talking about like the consequences of World War II. Well, we saw the rise of many things, the United Nations, and then that leads to other things down the line. Like the American CIA also came about in 1947, right? And then we saw the rise of Chairman Mao in 1949. And, Alex Jones and David Knight on InfoWars talked about that so much about how that's a consequence of World War II. And also the CIA installed Chairman Mao, and that led to, the slave labor population, the people that make your t shirts and your underwear. But when we want to look at some of the things leading up to that, it's like World War II was the financial connections were on both sides and they were intertwined. Like the British and the Nazis were completely connected. And the Lyndon LaRouche movement identifies this very specifically through the actions of an individual named Hjalmar Schacht, Schacht. Hjalmar Schacht was the finance and economics minister of Nazi Germany, and he was on very good terms with the finance and economics minister of Great Britain. So he pulled them all in, and it's sort of just like World War II was a British Nazi plan, and it also involved people from America because Prescott Bush the grandfather of George W. Bush and the father of H.W. Prescott Bush was involved with the sort of Nazi financierings, the Nazi financial connections coming from America, mind you, supporting Nazi Germany. And this is does all mentioned in the book George Bush, the unauthorized biography. Once again, talking about H.W. Bush 41. That's available online for free, actually. But we always have to take that stuff with a grain of salt. This stuff kind of expanded onward into something like the European Union. And there's a very famous clip of Alex Jones talking about the Bilderberg Group on the show was called The Sunday Politics, hosted by Andrew Neil. And it's like, that stuff's kind of fascinating, actually. I mean, I don't take Alex Jones very seriously to 100% credibility. But when you want to listen to something like that, they're sort of saying that the European Union was a Nazi plan. It was something that was started by the first head of the Bilderberg Group, Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands. Because remember, the Bilderberg Group is the largest lobbying group in Europe. They control most of the actions on the European continent. Or at the very least, if you actually want to use very specific language, they have a strong influence over actions on the European continent, principally the EU. And this was started by Prince Bernhard, who was a Nazi sympathizer, and Prince Bernhard is also has direct connections to Prince Philip of Great Britain. And they started the World Wildlife Fund together, and the Lyndon LaRouche movement has some interesting things about that, sort of saying that prior to 1965, no one cared about like this world wildlife stuff. No one cared about environmentalism prior to 1965. So they say. So they say. This is their theory, right? Well, it's like Prince Bernhard and Prince Philip kind of took the British Animal Registry. Like the World Wildlife Fund used to just be a way that the empire, that is the British Empire, could catalog and record all of their animals that were in the forests and on the in the African colonies. Like, like what is the size and scope of the forests in Africa and in India and so on, and how many animals approximately are in their colonies. And then that went on to become the World Wildlife Fund. But they went about this in sort of a pro environmental ecological way to kind of go with the eugenics movement, to talk about how people need to die for the earth so that they can have a lower population on Earth. This is eugenics. They want to reduce the population so it will be easier to control. And one of the ways they do this is they kind of promote this stuff about how humans are destructive. We need to kind of not love humanity. We need to love the Earth more so people don't want to have children. They view this as sort of a eugenics thing that was started by Prince Bernhard and Prince Philip. Once again, British Nazi connections, all of the sort of ruling elites are connected. They never lose. It's like heads I win, tails you lose. They kind of try to rig the system to the point where they are never going to lose or be defeated. So, are you following everything so far? The fact of the matter is that there are these very old financial connections that just keep going on and on and on, and they have people that are supporting them, and they also are able to absorb new people into this type of oligarchical sphere, this oligarchy. Remember, aristocracy is done by bloodline. Oligarchy is done by just a select group of people. And the oligarchs actually recognize that, and they're able to pull in new people that are useful and beneficial to them. Is all of this stuff true? These British New World Order theories that the kind of British Empire was just financially in sync with other ruling powers around Europe, principally Nazi Germany, and they were just kind of all in cahoots the whole time. They were all just playing a rigged game that just benefited the oligarchs and destroyed the common individual. Is all of that stuff true? In all reality, I think that there is about half truths to that. I mean, it's quite a big step. It's a very big step to say, though, especially some of the stuff about how the Bilderberg Group controls the EU completely, or they strongly influence the EU to their advantage. We definitely say that there are many principal individuals that are involved with this. Henry Kissinger, David Rockefeller were involved with the Bilderberg Group for a very long time, and I think Kissinger still is, even at age 95, 96, whatever age he is now. But to say that they actually have as much power as people think they do, I'm a little bit skeptical, but I always want to investigate. It's really fascinating, though, when people talk about the kind of connections between the British Empire and Nazi Germany, sort of trying to say that it's just like it's the same financial controls that we're trying to dominate. It's the same people in power that are just benefiting from this. I mean, the war is being fought by the common individual, the common man, and of course, like many people are involved with this, but not the royals, not the oligarchs. The oligarchs themselves are far away from this stuff and they don't want to get hurt at all. I mean, they want to try and distance themselves as much as possible from these conflicts. And this also relates to something much bigger. We've kind of said stuff about the time in the mid 20th century. When we want to talk about more British New World Order theories, let's look at the Anglo-American Alliance, as they put forward. And they've talked about this a lot in Alex Jones's film The Obama Deception. The Anglo-American Alliance, this is also described as the Washington, New York, London connection, really trying to say that these three cities have an enormous impact on the world. And I used to say that it's really Washington, New York, London, and Tel Aviv. I just sort of felt that a lot of people were afraid to address the kind of Tel Aviv angle of it. Well, now we should say Jerusalem because they're going to be moving the embassy there, capital. You know the story about that. But I was really just sort of feeling that people were afraid of kind of tying Israel into this stuff to be because they didn't want to be accused of being anti-Semitic. I mean, I'm not anti-Semitic. I mean, it's just kind of it sort of just seems like it's somewhat factual that they are also connected in this kind of Anglo-American Israeli alliance. Really, it's what it is. But saying that these three cities, Washington, New York, and London, have a very large impact on just all the global affairs. We got New York with the stock market, the NYSE, and then we have Washington with the White House, and London, of course, with Downing Street, and we have the Prime Minister, the House of Lords, House of Commons, all of that. And these three things have just an enormous influence over all global events. And you know this that to a certain extent. I mean, the United States has a large impact on world events, right? Sure. But what about Great Britain? Does this little island on the edge of the North Sea have too much influence over world affairs? A lot of people would say yes, absolutely. Why? Because it's the remnants of the British Empire. These financial connections never went away. And yes, the British still have territories like the Falkland Islands and what is it? Oh, what's the name of that other island? I mean, we have St. Helena's, but I'm thinking of Ascension Island or something like that. Anyway, they have like, islands dotted around the globe and a variety of other territories. They have territories, right? But none of them are super powerful. So why are we still talking about Great Britain? Well, because the economic and financial connections of the past have never dissolved. The oligarchs have never gone away, and their entire existence is based on this fact. They want to exist to preserve oligarchy. I'm very skeptical of this New World Order stuff. I'm very skeptical of the concept that people try to put out, the narrative that they try to put out that there are just global elites sitting around a table trying to come up with these eugenics conspiracies to try and destroy humanity so it'll be easier for them to control everything. I'm skeptical of that, but I've said this on this channel many times. I do say that oligarchy is real, that you can have a small group of people trying to control things, and that you pull people into your small group who are useful to you to further the agenda of your group. And there is kind of a large oligarchy that can control world events. And we've talked about how, it'd be like the President of the United States, the Prime Minister of England, and the Prime Minister of Israel, unfortunately. I mean, but when I say that, I mean, it's like the, uh, the sort of oligarchy is growing in that sense. But not trying to sound anti-Semitic. I know that stuff's coming already. But anyway, when we want to look at these kind of British New World Order theories, how do we know exactly where it begins and where it ends? What we can say is that there is an enormous amount of influence that is focused on the President of the United States, the Prime Minister of England. And if we look at this throughout the course of history, the British Empire did have an enormous amount of influence on geopolitical events. Even if you look at the Arabian Peninsula, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Yemen, those borders were carved by colonizers. And you want a better example, look at something like Nigeria. And these things also come back to their existing historical connections. One of the big things that we need to note with this is that, I mean, this comes actually to us, I think, from LaRouche when he said that if you want to understand your role in the present day, you have to go back at least 600 or 700 years, and you just sort of see that it's the same sort of financial and economic system. It's just passed down from generation to generation. There are elite circles that are trying to absorb the power for their own benefit. There are elite circles that are trying to hold on to this power and not relinquish it. So we need to kind of just recognize that these things could be very real. I hope to do a little more investigation on whether or not these things, the kind of connections of the British financial and economic ministry with the Nazi German economics ministry. And I've mentioned I've been reading the book, The Ugly Truth About Milton Friedman, that talks all about Hjalmar Schacht. And I hope to get more into that, though. I mean, of course, as I mentioned, it's about Milton Friedman, so he's the kind of center focus of the book. But I would like to learn more about Schacht, and there's a biography out there on Hjalmar Schacht that I hope to read, maybe in over the course of the next year or something. I'll try to get my hands on a copy of that. But the whole thing is, we need to approach the New World Order with a grain of salt. When you sort of just try to say that there are the globalists, the tyrants, the social engineers that Alex Jones calls them, that sounds very exaggerated. That sounds like he is almost trying to be hyperbolic, blow this thing out of proportion. But in reality, what is so crazy about saying that there are oligarchs? What is so ridiculous about saying that there are people in power and they unify and then they can pull in new people into their group? Somebody such as Barack Obama, somebody such as Donald Trump, and of course people like David Cameron and Theresa May, they can be pulled into the oligarchy. And when you look at someone like George W. Bush, the whole point with them is that they already were part of this. And everybody knows this. I mean, like, that's one of the biggest things that they were saying about Jeb Bush becoming president. Oh, it's like he's an oligarch. I mean, his father was president, his brother was president, as well as we once again mentioned that his grandfather was involved with some kind of, I'd say the sort of Prescott Bush connections to Nazi Germany are a little bit controversial in the sense that they're not very widely accepted. And they are not very well reported in any sort of mainstream sense. I mean, you hear that George Bush's grandfather was financing Nazi Germany. I mean, you think that should be like in every history book in high school and university or something. Sounds like kind of a big deal, right? Well, I mean that's why I get a little bit skeptical about some of this stuff. Also, when it comes to the eugenics things, it's almost like you do have Prince Philip saying in the 1980s he wants to be reincarnated as a deadly virus to destroy the massive amounts of the population. One of the things that this comes to us from is that there are things about Malthus and Malthusianism, as well as things about Charles Darwin. But let's talk about Malthus first. The whole concept of the world's population will grow so big that the food production that we have will not be sufficient. In short, the population will get so big, and that just we won't have enough food to go around. And this comes to us from actually an inspiration to Malthus was Giovanni Maria Ortes, the defrocked monk from Venice. Once again, we're back in Venice, and I believe he belonged to the Salon Redato Morosini or something like that. And he came up with the carrying capacity. He theorized that the world could not have more than 3 billion people, which is a genuinely false notion. They tried to say though that Ortes was a kook and that he wasn't accurate, but his narrative was beneficial to the oligarchs, so they began going with this, and that's why things like Thomas Malthus rose to power because he was saying almost the same thing. I guess you would say the Tax Wall Street Party and the LaRouche movement accuse Malthus as well as Jeremy Bentham and James Mill, of fabricating and plagiarizing their works from Jean Maria Ortes. But um, I definitely would say that when you read Malthus and Ortes side by side, you see the similarities. I mean, that really does sound like, that could be somewhat true. I mean, it could be somewhat true that like that is the kind of influential source that triggered the writings of Malthusianism. But the thing about the carrying capacity is that it's blatantly false. We have 7 billion on the planet now, and I was just listening to something on YouTube that was saying that the Earth's population is going to plateau at 9 billion. It's most likely we won't go to 10 billion very soon. So, in short, these things that this kind of narrative is not true, there is no carrying capacity. But the global elites might not be aware, they might not want to hear that because it's not beneficial to their agenda. So says the theory. Some of the eugenics conspiracies are rather well, not all of them are fake. I mean, if you read the story of Carrie Buck, the woman who was sterilized against her will, and her sister as well was also sterilized against her will, and what was it, over 60,000 or something individuals were in the United States were sterilized against their will, even just for sort of oh, I believe it's Oliver Wendell Holmes was the on the Supreme Court at the time, and it was the concept of just they didn't want people who were feeble-minded. They didn't want people who were not very intelligent. I mean, for lack of a better term, and yes, you could even throw in words like special or something like that, as well as the blind and the deaf. And once again, it's like it's trying to reduce the population, and there are certain degrees of truth with these eugenics movements and these eugenics conspiracies. I mean, like, yes, they do try to eliminate certain people from the population. And once again, that was I was talking about the sterilization of Carrie Buck, and they wrote a book about her called Imbeciles, called The Sterilization of Carrie Buck, Buck, Buck. And it was actually told that I read also that Adolf Hitler's concept of the Holocaust was all about, it was inspired from the existing eugenics movements, except instead of trying to remove deaf people and blind people and feeble minded people, he tried to remove the Jews. Once again, not anti Semitic. I'm not encouraging that. I love Jewish people. Baruch Hashem. But when you actually want to sort of look at this stuff throughout history, you do see a pattern. And they like, on the one hand, it might be cherry picking to get a desired result. On the other hand, it might be sort of finding the diamonds in the rough, finding, like the grains of truth, if you will. I mean, I'm a very big skeptic with this New World Order stuff. But the thing that we kind of can come away with is that oligarchy is a real thing. There are small groups of people that try to control things. There also are powerful connections that get carried on from generation to generation. Look at the Rockefeller family on their own. I mean, are you trying to say that they don't have power that's been carried down generation to generation? Look at some of the other elite families, like the Rothschilds. Are you trying to say they don't exist? Absolutely, they exist. And they can also pull new people into their circles. The same way, like that the Rockefellers pulled in Henry Kissinger, and then that leads us to Kissinger and Associates. And on one of these uploads, I think it was the Alex Jones upload, we talked about the Council on Foreign Relations. And one of the leaders of the CFR, Council on Foreign Relations, is the vice president of Kissinger and Associates, Henry Kissinger's consulting firm, at least the last time I looked at their website. They talk about this very openly, hiding in plain sight. There are certain levels of oligarchy in the world. And if you want to call that a new world order, it's more like an old world order, actually. I mean, if it's always been existing, there have just been sort of economic and financial controls that actually have greater influence than people give them to. Think about what you hear about the deep state, the shadow government, the invisible government, the parallel government. When you listen to all these things, it's like there's a reason why people talk about corporations so much. There's a reason why people talk about the military industrial complex so much. It's because we don't only live in a political world, we live in a political and an economic world. And sometimes, the economic power of elite circles or we should say the economic power of oligarchs, is difficult to see. Well, that's all for me now, and until next time, thank you to everyone who's listened this far into the podcast, and have a good night, have a good morning wherever you are. Until next time.